Welcome to MyLife Chassidus Applied, episode 571, a special Yud Tes Kislev edition. This program is in loving memory of Miriam Bas Elio, Alter Rebbe, and in merit of Baruch Binyamin ben Menucha Lana Altois, Yukusil ben Leah Rachel and Rachel Bas Liba Farkash, dedicated by Pinchas Todres ben Miriam and Sarah Bas Rachel Altois. As I said, a special Yud Tes Kislev edition, Chassidus Applied. When is the Rosh Hashana of Chassidus? On Yud Tes Kislev. Why? Why is it called the Rosh Hashana of Chassidus? The reason is because in the year 1798, the Hebrew year Tovkuf Nun Tes, the Alter Rebbe was arrested by the Russian Tsarist authorities with a fraudulent and accusations by his enemies of being a counter-revolutionary, basically going against the Russian government, all kinds of trumped-up fake charges. But by Chassidim and by the Rebbeim themselves, every challenge was always seen as something deeper. It means that in heaven there was a question about the Alter Rebbe's yechidus, the way he was now innovating a new way of teaching Chassidus in a broader way, expansively to the public. Now, when I say new, in Torah, nothing is new. Everything comes from Matan Torah. Everything a student is mechadish, even if you call it chiddush, an innovation, something new, was given at Sinai. However, there are new methods. So the methodology of Torah is consistent and never changes. But there are new manners in that method itself of how that's conveyed, and in what manner, and what language, what audiences. Penimiyus HaTorah, the inner dimension of Torah, was always kept very secret, kept very discreet, simply because of the subtlety of its ideas, and to preserve its integrity, it was taught, as the Mishnah says in Chagiga, b'yachid. You study this alone, or two people. And it was always studied in very small groups. It was always there, the inner dimension of Torah, but it was there, as I said, in a discrete fashion. As the generations passed, especially after the Arizal, things began to change. The spreading of inner dimension of Torah became more expansive. The Arizal said, mitzvah legale zeisa chochmah. Now it's a mitzvah to reveal it. And there are two reasons given for that. One is the darkness of the challenges of this material world, of golus and exile. As they grew more intense, we need more light to counter that. Basically, magdim refuah lamaka, you need the healing to deal with the ailments. And the spiritual dimensions of Torah have exactly that power. And the second reason, as we get closer to Mashiach, we start getting a taste. Like on Friday, you start tasting the appetizer of Shabbos, tasting of the Torah that will be revealed when Mashiach comes. Will build the inner dimension of the world being filled with divine knowledge as the waters cover the sea. And the Rebbe explains that these two reasons are actually interdependent. Because we're getting closer to Mashiach, so the dawn, before the dawn is always the darkest time. And precisely because we need more light, that's exactly what it means before Mashiach, we're getting more light to counter that darkness. So this accelerated the Arizal, then the students of the Arizal, until the Baal Shem Tov came and he began teaching it in the words of the Mashiach that Baal Shem Tov heard from Mashiach. When will you, Mashiach, come? When your wellspring, Baal Shem Tov Chassidus wellsprings will spread outward. And then the Alter Rebbe, the student of the Maggid, a student of the Baal Shem Tov, began spreading it even more Chassidus Chabad in a way that can be understood by everybody. Until then it was more cryptic, very short. You needed to have the proper preparations. You always need the proper preparations, but this became now available to all. So, long story short, this created a challenge in heaven. Is the Alter Rebbe doing the right thing? That's how the arrest was seen. And as such, the vindication came when the Alter Rebbe was freed, completely exonerated of all these charges. We knew that meant that in heaven, the door was open, the license was given that the Alter Rebbe is doing well. As we're told the story that when he was in prison, the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid came to visit him, the Alter Rebbe. And he asked, what should I do? They told him, you will be freed. So what should I do afterwards? Should I stop teaching? Should I pause? Should I slow down? Should I do it in another man? They said, no, not only should you teach, you should continue teaching and growing. And that's indeed what the Alter Rebbe did. What in the world of Chassidim we call far Petersburg or noch Petersburg, before Petersburg and after Petersburg. Petersburg is a statement describing that period when he was imprisoned in Petersburg. Before Petersburg is the maamarim and the discourses of Alter Rebbe were brief, tsarim, shorter, more compact. Afterwards, they began to expand even more in a completely new level. And then, with the Rebbeim that came afterwards, the Mittler Rebbe, and so on, it continued to grow and expand. So basically, Yud Tes Kislev was a watershed moment where the mandate was given and endorsed from above that this is the right approach. And indeed, we see today the absolute necessity for the Penimiyus HaTorah, the soul of Torah. The Talmud teaches you the mechanics, what Shabbos is, what kosher is. The Penimiyus HaTorah, the inner dimension, is the soul of Torah, as the Zohar puts it. That adds the passion, the personal relevance, the connection. So Jews always had it, but we lived in a much more insulated and a much more simpler, innocent, naive world. We picked up certain instincts simply from the purity of the smell of the chicken soup in our grandmother's kitchen. But once the world opened up, Chassidus came exactly then, during the time of the Enlightenment, time of emancipation of the Jews, the beginnings of what we call the modern era. You go back, 1798, we're talking about the beginnings of when the United States became a country. The world was changing, so Chassidus came along the perfect time to address the new challenges of a modern world, the conflicts between modernity and faith, between science and religion, between God and the material world, and all that came with that. The Chassidus teaches the idea of the ultimate unity between the divine and existence, that there's not a dichotomy, that you could integrate the two. So this was always known and it was always followed. Hashem Echad, we say in Shema, ultimate unity. But now we needed to have much more of a mechanism, a comprehensive blueprint of how to do so. So we're told that the Baal Shem Tov taught us that every person can now access the divine no matter where they are. And the Alter Rebbe taught us how everyone can do so. The Baal Shem Tov gave us the ladder. The Alter Rebbe taught us how to climb the ladder. And the ladder is a bridge, an interface between the transcendent and the immanent, the transcendent and existence. And that, in a nutshell, my friends, is the essence of the Rosh Hashana of Chassidus, Yud Tes Kislev, the vindication, when that license, when the mandate was formalized. And we say indeed, L'shana Teva, and Yud Tes Kislev, L'shana Teva, B'limud Chassidus, or B'tarkei Chassidus, the learning of Chassidus and its paths, and following its paths. So this is what we celebrate every year on Rosh Hashana of Chassidus, Yud Tes Kislev. Of course, the Alter Rebbe, founder of Chassidus Chabad, wrote the Sefer Tanya, that's called the Bible, the Torah Shebiksav of Chassidus. So here we have just an overview of what Yud Tes Kislev is. Now we can go and say, what do we learn from this day? So the answer, what we learn from this day, that this day gives us a gift. Again, a Torah that was always here, but it was hidden, not known. Alter Rebbe took it to a whole other level. Chabad manifested it and dressed it up in garments so that we can understand and speak about the divine in a language with human examples. Mepsare Echza Lakah is one of the main things the Alter Rebbe introduced. When you study Kabbalah, you see esoteric and spiritual mystical concepts. The Alter Rebbe always gave everything, Mepsare, from my flesh I behold God, examples from human nature, from the world's nature, from examples that we can find within ourselves, which are essentially manifestations of the divine within our very existence. And as such, it becomes far more palpable and palatable and much more internalized, and we can integrate it into our daily lives, into a truly revolutionary psychological blueprint for life. So on a day like this, we honor that, we celebrate it, we recommit, and we renew our contract with this Rosh Hashana of Chassidus, exactly what we do Rosh Hashana on Tishrei, when the Rosh Hashana of the new year, we begin a new year, the new resolutions, a new energy, and the same thing with Yud Tes Kislev. So that's what we learn from this day. We also learn from this day that nothing is impossible. That yes, there are impediments, and there can be arrests, and there can be all kinds of difficulties, yet when you forge ahead, and you're committed, and you're tied above, you don't fall below. The Alter Rebbe could have easily, it says, freed himself by disavowing any connection with the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid, but he didn't want to for one moment disconnect. So it's about connecting to the true path, to God, to our faith, to the generations before us, and that's all part of what Yud Tes Kislev is about. Obviously, Yud Tes Kislev has so much, and so much has been written, so much has been said, and so much could be said. We have all from the Rebbe, all the years, every year of farbrengen Yud Tes Kislev, where the Rebbe would, like literally, like an overwhelming flood, in a good way flood, wellsprings of information about Yud Tes Kislev, lessons to be learned, lessons for each of us, lessons for our families, for our communities, lessons even about how to change the world. Hopefully we'll talk about some of that as we go along. But I wanted to first give this overview. And with that, let's continue with a few of the questions that came in. I refer you to chassidusapplied.com as our website, where you can find all previous programs that we've done on Yud Tes Kislev in previous years. chassidusapplied.com. You can also submit your questions there, completely anonymous. Any question is acceptable. Nothing is taboo. Nothing is off limits. And many other resources and chassidus that you can find. We just began, actually. I was teaching a daily class in Hemshech Chaim Beis from the Rebbe Rashab for many years. We just began teaching, learning together another Hemshech Samach Vav, a Hemshech from Tofrei Samach Vav, which I welcome you also to join. You go to samachvav.com. It's all part of chassidusapplied.com. We'll give you the information, the daily Zoom, the daily YouTube, live classes. You can ask live questions. It's a group study, but you could also listen to it afterwards on Spotify and YouTube and on all our platforms. Okay. So here's, of course, the big question. Why was there a heavenly accusation against the Alter Rebbe for teaching Chassidus? What could be wrong with that? Or as one person wrote it, if I studied the Torah and found things in it that enhanced my life physically and spiritually, and then I shared what I found with my friends so they could benefit too, would anyone say I did something wrong? So why was there a heavenly accusation against the Alter Rebbe for spreading Chassidus, teaching and spreading Chassidus? Writing the Tanya. He learned Chassidus and saw how beneficial it is, so he taught it so that others can benefit too, especially since we recently learned the difference between Noach and Avram, in that Noach kept his knowledge to himself, so he could only benefit, but Avram went out and taught all his neighbors, so they all could benefit too, and Avram's service is considered better. I can't understand why the Alter Rebbe did wrong to have to suffer 53 days in jail. I know he was ultimately vindicated, but he still suffered for 53 days. Should we be afraid to say a dvar Torah at the Shabbos table, lest the heavenly court make an accusation against us? I think the heavenly court needs to apologize to the Alter Rebbe and compensate him for his pain and suffering by sending Mashiach right away. Well, another person phrased it this way. How is the rest of the Alter Rebbe for teaching Chassidus consistent with the teaching? If you know an Aleph, you have to teach an Aleph, which means if you know parts of Torah, you have to teach it to others. Even if you know it's only the letter Aleph. The Alter Rebbe knew Chassidus, so he taught it. He did absolutely nothing wrong, and the proof is that he was vindicated in the heavenly court. Okay. And many other such questions have come in now, also in previous years. I've discussed it a number of times. So the truth is we've answered the question already earlier in this program, but I want to elaborate a bit more. Make the question even stronger. You know, it's one thing a person does something wrong, God forbid. So fine. So there's a challenge and say, you're doing something wrong and we need justice. Here a man is teaching Torah and teaching the treasures of Torah, Penimiyus HaTorah. Why would he be guilty of something? But you have to keep in mind something much deeper going on here. God created the world for a purpose. The purpose is because he desired to have a home in this lowest of worlds, in this material world. He concealed his presence. The conscious presence of the divine is concealed to the point we live in a world, like he explains the Bala Geula of Yud Tes Kislev in Tanya chapter 36, to the point that this world actually not only conceals, but actually defies God. You could have someone saying, I and nothing else, ignoring, defying God. And in that world, he wants us to work hard and come to discover the divine and reveal it to the point that he is comfortable, a dira, a home in this world. To do so, he had to conceal the presence, because as long as godliness and the truth of divine consciousness is omnipresent, meaning also from our point of view, not just from the reality point of view, then there's no tachtenim. As he explains in Tanya, tachtenim means in level of concealment. It doesn't mean physically the lowest, it means spiritually the lowest, the most concealed. So the concealment, even though it has a purpose, but the concealment is, at the end of the day, is the force that we need to contend with. So whenever there's going to be a revelation, there's always going to be a concealment that challenges it. That's why we say, Zelu mazeh asalakim. God created the world like parallel worlds, a mirror image. A divine soul created an animal soul, as he explains in Tanya. The divine soul has 10 faculties, the animal soul has 10 faculties. And they are equal forces, because the only way to really have tachtenim, if you give an edge to the divine soul, then we're not playing a game here, it's a serious business. The Alter Rebbe, learning from his master, who learned from his master, saw the need to begin spreading chassidus, because the darkness was intensifying. There was a schism going on, a lot of dissonance in the Jewish world and the Torah world. He saw the need. However, immediately the forces of concealment, so to speak, now pop up. Is it the time? Maybe it's the wrong thing to do. People will abuse it. So yes, there could be nefarious forces at work, but there's also legitimate concerns. Remember a little while earlier, there was the Shabbos Tzvi fiasco. Debacle, whatever you want to call it. So Jews were very wary. And can abuse? Yes, of course, spirituality can be used. Shabbos Tzvi abused it. So did Jacob Frank. Took spiritual ideas and turned it into things I don't even want to repeat. Orgies, trying to sanctify the profane. Because there's a very thin line between spirituality, sensuality, and sexuality. So be very careful. The more intimate you go into spiritual realms, there has to be extreme care. So there are a lot of concerns. And there's actually the story told, where one of the Chassidim saw a page of Chassidus rolling around on the ground. It fell to the ground. And he said, you see, people are not appreciating it. It's just they're taking it for granted. And it was so to speak, a question on the Maggid's teaching of Torah. Because he was teaching, and here people are not respecting it properly. So maybe it has to be taken. Maybe that was a sign that we have to slow down, be careful, more discretion. Maybe choosing only the elite. You can't just spread it to everyone. People will again abuse it. And the Alter Rebbe then gave the beautiful, powerful example of a king, a king whose child became very ill. His heir to the throne, to the point he was on his deathbed. Doctors had given up, they couldn't do anything. They looked for doctors all over the world to try to help the child. Nothing. Finally, one doctor said, perhaps the king's crown has a precious jewel, a very rare jewel in it, that when you crush it and turn it into powder, it has an elixir. It has healing powers. If you mix that with water, so the child who is comatose, if you can get a little of that water with the powder between his clenched teeth, it may save his life. So the king, of course, said immediately yes. Even though his crown, which defined him as king, was dependent on that very jewel, crown jewel, yet, of course, what does he need a crown for if his child is about to die? And it's only a question, maybe something will get through his teeth, and some will spill on the floor, like the page of Chassidus that was rolling on the floor. So the Alter Rebbe explained, Bala Geula, that Penimiyus HaTorah is that crown jewel. The Jewish people were in a comatose state, we're told, at the time of the Baal Shem Tov, spiritually. And things were not looking good. They were getting more and more difficult. all the oppression, all the anxiety, everything had built up to the point of desperation. And of course, the modern world was also breathing down their backs, which would lead to tremendous assimilation. So the Alter Rebbe said the teaching of Chassidus is saving the child's life, even if it's a doubt. And here we didn't have that doubt. So you take the crown jewel, Penimiyus HaTorah, Chassidus, and you do whatever it takes, even to a child that may not be well, in order to save the child's life. And of course he was right. Later the Maggid would say, this is what saved me, saved my, because it was a limud zchus, the merit of the Maggid's approach. The Alter Rebbe, of course, took it to a whole other level. So what do we take away from all of this? We take that there's a challenge when it comes to teaching new levels of Torah. There was a challenge by Matan Torah, by Sinai. There was a challenge every time a new revelation in Torah took place. The negative energies. So the vindication, therefore, is so much greater. So the Baal Shem Tov Rebbe was not doing anything wrong. Obviously, he was teaching Torah, Chassidus. But when you're dealing with such high stakes, you can imagine that such a keneged, the other side comes to challenge. So that's the point. So no, we should not be afraid to say dvar Torah. First of all, once the door was opened, then we were given this license. Now it's a mitzvah to spread Torah and Chassidus. Secondly, in general, our role has to always be bringing positive energy. The Alter Rebbe was on that level, so he was challenged. But now that vindication has come to us. Okay. Another interesting question, which I don't think I've ever really dealt with. Someone writes like this: how do you compare the Alter Rebbe's spreading of Chassidus to other Kabbalists who taught Penimiyus HaTorah? Why did they not face resistance? So a person writes, Shalom Avracha Reb Simon. Having read and listened to recent shiurim regarding Yud Tes Kislev, I have the following question. The idea that the Baal Tanya bringing Torah Sanister, Torah Sanister is the mystical, the esoteric, Kabbalah, into the masses, due to the need of the time, people at low spiritual level, or to bring Mashiach closer, etc. A justification for this innovative step is based on the teaching of the Arizal, who began to popularize Kabbalah during his lifetime, and thereby left Chassidus and primarily Chabad to continue and massively expand that teaching. Like I mentioned before, mitzvah legal is zeisa chachma. I have read that there were many Talmidim of the Arizal. Rabbi Chaim Vital mentions a bunch of others, but they're not direct Talmidim. There's, of course, Rabbi Yisrael Sarug. He mentions Rashash, the Gra, Ramchal, the Lashem, and many more, whom all lived in different places among different communities over the three centuries from the Arizal's death, but never seemed to want to revolutionize like Chabad. Are we to think that this was a machlekes between Mekobolim, where the Baal HaTanya was right and everyone else was wrong? Difficult for me to accept. Or are there different schools of thought emanating out from the Arizal, Chabad being one of them? The problem with that being, that would minimize the global impact. Is this the only one of many ways to understand the Arizal? Or can we say that this was a new direction, not based on the Arizal's teaching, or his close Talmidim, but at Tzerech Hashah of the time, meaning a need at the time? I find it difficult to understand how that can be such a wide difference in opinions between Mukabalim, all following the Arizal, which would have such seismic ramifications on Yiddishkeit. Perhaps Elu ve'elu can be employed here, meaning Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim, everyone is speaking the words of God, but wondering if there's something more fundamental. Kol Tuv. Okay. So it's a good question to understand the context. Now, obviously, we're talking here only legitimate Kabbalists, not anyone who comes and just says, I'm teaching Kabbalah. So the Arizal indeed had, Rabbi Chaim Vital was his primary student, and Rabbi Chaim Vital says, I got permission from the Arizal to be the exclusive channel to pass on the teaching of the Arizal. But there was another student, Rabbi Sol Sarug. And Rabbi Sol Sarug left Tzfas, went to Italy, other places in Europe, and was teaching Kabbalah too, the Arizal's Kabbalah. His approach was in some ways different, some ways in common with Rabbi Chaim Vital, but there were actually students of the Arizal that did not feel Rabbi Yisrael Sarug has the authority to do so. No one questioned his own personality, but they felt it was only the authority of Rabbi Chaim Vital, and they would not study material from Yisrael Sarug and his students, which include the Emek HaMelech, the Mishnah's Chassidim, and others. But the Rebbe makes it clear that once it came into Chassidus, the Alter Rebbe began quoting both from the Emek HaMelech and Mishnah's Chassidim and Rabbi Chaim Vital, knowing that there was this so-called two different schools of thought, and brought the best from all of them and integrated them. So we see from that there is the Elu ve'elu aspect. And it's not a contradiction. Rabbi Chaim Vital was given the main mandate, but we find certain sugyas. Shashua Melech Batz Musay, you find the name of Kamelech from the Rabbi Yisrael Surug. The Rishimu, even though it's mentioned in Eitz Chaim and Eitz Chaim, it's elaborated upon by the Emek HaMelech and others. So the point being that now we take from all of them. So whoever is legitimate, just like in Nigla, you have in Gemara also, there were people who was ba'as, that there were strong disagreements, Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, others. But it's all Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim, as long as they're going under the rubric and the methodology of Torah, the Yud Gimel Midas HaTorah Nedreshes Behem, the Talmud is filled with disagreements. And then there's the way we pass kan halacha, consensus, and all the different methods that are used. So in Kabbalah you have also different schools of thought, different approaches. And remember, pre-Arizal, there were also many Mukabalim. The Ramak was a contemporary of the Arizal, older than him. He wrote the Pardes. Pardes has somewhat of a different approach than the Arizal. Not different as you can't reconcile. For example, it says in Chassidus that the Pardes Ramak didn't know from the Tzimtzum. So his whole teachings is without the Tzimtzum addition. Now we do know from the Arizal Tzimtzum, and still we bring together the Pardes and the Ramak of the Pardes and the Arizal and so on. Now, as long as somebody has the credentials and is Kabbalah ish mepi ish, so yes, there were many different schools of thought. There was the Shalah, there's the Maral. Give a whole list of Mukabalim. There's Rab Adam Baal Shem Tov, the different traditions that were passed on from the Guri Arizal, meaning the students and the students of the students of the Arizal. Now comes Baal Shem Tov, just skipping over. He, Miyasid, founds Chassidus Klolis, followed by the Maggid. Then the Alter Rebbe founds Chassidus Chabad. The Alter Rebbe had colleagues, Rabbi Jacobson and many others, and they wrote Svarim. They all were Makabel from the Maggid, and there were the different students who were Makabel from the Baal Shem Tov. There are things that are mamish you see in common, and there were things that each one took a certain type of approach. There were even disagreements, where there were questions about the Alter Rebbe's approach, that some people had questions about. And they challenged it. Then it was defended by the Alter Rebbe, by Levi Yisrael, by Ditchever, and Beis Rebbe talks about this. So, how do you explain that? Because they were all tzaddikim, they were all rebbes in their own right, and they had different approaches. Torah is not a nada or pashta, which means it's like a rivers that pass like the Shvatim, 12 Shvatim. There were 12 paths when the sea parted. Each had their approach. Then there's a Shara Kelel. There's an all-encompassing approach that includes them all. And that's how we look at it. So anyone that's a legitimate, and that has to be established by going to experts and saying who are people who are legitimate. There are some that are controversial. Some accept and some don't accept. Some say there are certain Kabbalistic teachers who are brilliant, but it was more seichel anushi. It was more their human seichel. Others were mekabel, like Ruach HaKodesh, that you trust as a direct channel from above. Now, regarding the resistance, it was primarily, especially the Alter Rebbe, that really developed the whole comprehensive system and an approach to really spread it. So obviously the resistance there was maybe the strongest. Was there resistance to other Kabbalists? It's an interesting question. Maybe there was. Was there resistance to the Arizal, for example? He said, Mitzvah legalizes achachma. So we don't find that he was arrested, but we do find that he was young when he was only a year, almost a little less than 2 years in Sfas. Maybe some of his challenges is something that we need to investigate. But if there was some great gili, you could imagine there probably was some form of resistance. What we're most aware of is the Alter Rebbe story. We're also aware of the Mittler Rebbe. Not just as Chabad Chassidim. Perhaps because the Alter Rebbe actually turned Chassidus, most of the Swarm, like Noam Elimelech, or Kedushas Levi, or the other, the Talmidei HaMaggid, did not turn it into a whole school of thought as in comprehensive Chassidus Chabad. So that may be a factor. But thank you for the question. It's a good question. I'm glad we're discussing it. Okay. Now, as far as a new direction, no, everything the Alter Rebbe writes and says, even though they're chidushim, is based on mipi svarim, mipi seifrim, was passed on to him what he was received from the Maggid, who received from the Baal Shem Tov, all the way, ish mipi ish, from the Arizal, going all the way back to the beginning, all the way to Moshe Rabbeinu. So there's no new direction. As I said, there's new approaches and new manifestations, but it's all based on that which comes before. And that's the very meaning of Kabbalah. You receive it from those that came before. Okay, with that, let's go to the next question. Is Chassidus based on the Zohar and Kabbalah or is it something entirely different? So it's definitely based on Kabbalah. And Kabbalah goes back, we talked about the Arizal, but before the Arizal, you have the Ramban, and you have the Ravid, and you have the different Sfarim, the Avedis HaKedesh. I mean, I can go through a whole list. Going back further, you go to the Zohar, Sefer HaBoyer, Sefer HaTmuna, Sefer Yetzirah, even earlier. So like it is with all Torah, everything is based on what came before. How it was taught, and what manner, that, of course, there are differences. It's interesting, Hagdama, in the later edition of Shemer Amunim, who is also from the students of the Arizal, another Mekubal, also Baal Nigla, Rabbi Yosef Irgas. In the new editions, there's a very powerful introduction that tells you the shtalshelus, the evolution of Kabbalah, how it was passed on. The leaders, great Kabbalistic leaders in each generation, going all the way back till the modern days. So if you're interested, I would check that out. So there's no question it's based on it. And yet we have an expression where the Rebbe Marash said, the world thinks that Chassidus is an explanation in Kabbalah. And the truth is, Kabbalah is an explanation of Chassidus. So of course, immediately, 1 second, Kabbalah came before Chassidus. So in Kuntas Inyon Shel Teres Chassidus, the Rebbe discusses it. There's another expression that says, Kabbalah took a great God and put it into the tzir of Adam Elyon, into a structure. Tzelem Elokim. Chassidus takes the structure of a human being and divests it and strips it of its structure and turns it into something godly. So there he explains the idea of yechida, that Chassidus is yechida. Kabbalah is chaya. This pshat remes drush sod, that's keneged nefesh ruach neshama chaya, and Chassidus is yechida like the etzem, as he explains there at length. So Kabbalah addresses the part of Torah that is the Sfiras Elyenas, the Elamis Elyenas, the Kavonis, and Chassidus really permeates all four. That's how he explains it there. You can check that out. It was actually said in Yud Tes Kislev farbrengen Tovshin Chavav, which now is from Chavav to Pevav, is 60 years ago. So many people are learning this Kuntas Inyon Shel Teres Chassidus, which is very fitting as we're celebrating now 60 years from when the Rebbe said that. You could say that landmark talk that he delivered on Yud Tes Kislev, Tovshin Chavav, basically the end of 1965. So it's 60 years. And he discusses that and many other items about Chassidus. So that's how we understand that. Okay. Next question. Is learning the Tanya compared to having a personal yechidus with the Alter Rebbe? Well, based on the Alter Rebbe's introduction to Tanya, the answer is yes. There he explains that people have been coming to me for advice. There's simply no time to constantly meet everybody. So I want to put it into a sefer as if it's a personal experience. And he goes at lengths to explain the mila that a sefer generally is not a personal experience. Can you combine the two? And he tries to, and makes the point that Tanya is that attempt to combine the two. That the sefer, because it's yedei makirei kamina, it's people that intimately familiar with, so then when you put it in a book, it's not just a book. It's a book that's conveying as if it was a personal experience. And he goes further and says, if you can't find the answers to all the drachim and avodas Hashem, you should go. He asked the Gdelim Shebeir, the people, I like to translate that as the emotionally intelligent and mature people of the city, to advise, and they should not withhold their counsel. And God will bless everyone, illuminating all their eyes. So clearly you see from that he sees Tanya as a personal experience. But you have to learn it that way. Remember, personal experience goes two ways. In Tovshin Daled, there's a beautiful sicha from the Frierdiker Rebbe. The second night of Pesach, 1944. Where he says the Chassidim, after Tanya came out, the manuscripts, we're talking about before Yud Tes Kislev. So we're talking about the years 1796, 1797. Before Tanya was published, but there were manuscripts that were going around. So Chassidim came to the Alter Rebbe and said, we don't understand Tanya. So the Alter Rebbe answered, because a halbe Zach nennt man nicht. You can't understand only when you get only half the story. What's the other half? Negine. Song. That's when the Tzemach Tzedek realized the power of song, as he explains there. What does that mean? It doesn't mean just singing Tanya with a melody, like a sing-song melody. It means that Tanya is not just some esoteric or abstract intellectual work. It has to be with the hergish of a nigin. When you sing a song, it touches your heart. Tanya is a personal experience. So yes, it's extremely profound and extremely scholarly in the style of the Alter Rebbe. But it's Chabad, Taka. But it's Chabad through Chagas. That has to be an emotional experience. That's personal. What's a yechidus at the end of the day? It's not just you're hearing advice from a smart Rebbe. You're having a personal, intimate connection. And that's one of the most important things in learning and applying Chassidus. Personally relating to it. That any dargi you read, it's not just a theological point, a nuance, or even a profound concept. It's all about a personal experience, like the Rebbe speaking to you. The Rebbe is saying a maamar, is learning a maamar with you. And you're asking him, what is the message of this maamar to me in my life? That's the question that has to be asked. That's how you internalize. And that's what the Alter Rebbe is saying. That's how you understand Tanya. It's not just a scholarly exercise. A niggin. It has to be like a niggin. So imagine when someone speaks to you, it could be a drasha, you speak, but someone sings to you, you feel something different. The famous story with the Alter Rebbe in Shklov, we gave a Meredika drasha. He was a tremendous guy in the Alter Rebbe. And as much as he took the people's hearts, he felt it wasn't complete till he sang. The Rebbe says, put him Tavshin Chai. He said, Tamru ki tev havaya, versuchten zet, as the Rebbe is good. And hundreds of people flowed and followed him because the song is what touched them. In addition to the Ge'enus, obviously. Okay. Next question. How did the Alter Rebbe deliver his teachings to us? Very good question. I'm glad you asked. A lot of people ask me that question. It's a good opportunity here. So the Alter Rebbe, after the Maggid's passing, of course he had directives from the Maggid of Mezritch, began to, as you look at Yom Yom, it says the exact years, Tov Kuf Lamed Gimel, and the following years began to develop Shittas Chassidus Chabad. And he was attracting people. In Yozhner, where he was, to the point later, there was the takonis, with the conditions that people can come and not come to see the Alter Rebbe. He was developing Chassidus. How did he present it? It was through Torah. He would teach Torah. And those was usually by Morim Ktsarim, short Torahs, similar to the Maggid and the Baal Shem Tov. He did it orally. We don't have any writings from those years. Chassidim wrote it down. As it continued, those years, these Hanochis got around. They were Chezim and Manichim that wrote it down. I don't know if we know exactly who were the writers at the time. We know a little later, which I'll get to in a few minutes. in the Tov Kuf Nun, well, it was earlier than that. At some point, around, we'd say probably Tov Kuf Mems, the Alter Rebbe began writing Tanya. We know it took him 20 years, the different versions of this. And again, it was in writing. This is the first thing he wrote in Chassidus. In Tov Kuf Nun Zayin. Well, Tov Kuf Nun Vav, Nun Zayin, these manuscripts were spreading, as I mentioned. And at some point they published Tanya in Tov Kuf Nun Zayin Nun Ches. It's before the arrest of Yud Tes Kislev. So there you had the first way the Alter Rebbe delivered in actual writing. But he was still saying Torah. First in Liozhene, then later in Liadi. And it was by Maggid of Mezritch, especially before Petersburg. And it was written down by Chassidim. The same way the Baal Shem Tov and Maggid's Torah was written. All, they said it orally, and their students wrote it down. As time passed, Alter Rebbe started saying longer Maimorim. So today we have Maimori Ktsarim, Maimori Admur Hazok and Ktsarim, and sometimes it identifies the years it was said. And we're talking now, the years would be basically the 1770, 1780. Then when the Alter Rebbe started saying Maimori more consistently, this is right now, we're talking Tov Kuf Samach Beis. So now we have Maimori Admur Hazok, and that starts those years, where he would deliver a Torah Friday night, Shabbos day. And the Manichim we know at the time was the Mittler Rebbe, his oldest son. Well, I should start with his brother, the Maril Rabbi Yehuda Leib. He would write down the Alter Rebbe. He was a Chezer Maniach. The Mittler Rebbe. The other son, Rabbi Moshe, the Alter Rebbe's son, Rabbi Moshe. Rabbi Pinchas Reizes, that's Hanochas Harab. And the Tzemach Tzedek, when he came of age, began to also write. So sometimes we'll have 5 versions of the same Maimer. And you can compare them. It's a fascinating study. But this is how the Alter Rebbe delivered. Friday nights for a certain period of years was Biyurim and Zoyar. And this became Biyuri Hazer that the Mittler Rebbe later composed. So the Sfarim we have, mostly besides Tanya, and besides Shulchan Aruch, and Hilchos Talmud Torah, and Hilchos Birchas Hanenin, which were written by the Alter Rebbe, are mostly Torah Likutei Torah, and all Maimori Admur Hazok are all orally delivered. We have today many of the Hanochas, as I said, some of them versions of the same Maimer. The Mittler Rebbe took the Maimorim, as I said, Zohar, and put it and organized it in the parshas of the Zohar. He did the same thing with the Siddur. He took all the Alter Rebbe's Maimorim on the different parts of davening, and the Yomim Tevim and so on, and turned it into Siddurim Dach. So that's how we have the Alter Rebbe's Torah. Just for the record, the Rabbeim afterwards, the Mittler Rebbe started the Mittler Rebbe, they wrote almost everything themselves. There are some Hanochas that others wrote, but mostly they wrote themselves. The Mittler Rebbe wrote entire Sfarim, but also Maimorim. And there's also Hanochas. Tzemach Tzedek the same. Reb Marash, Reb Rashab, the Frierdiker Rebbe. It's the Rebbe that actually didn't write that much. Besides, I'm not talking about letters. Maimorim almost exclusively, not exclusively, Hanochas. Many were edited by the Rebbe. There were 2 Maimorim in Tavshin Yud Aleph that the Rebbe began to write, but he never really went too far. Okay, so that covers that. Next question. What is a farbrengen and where did it originate from? Here, hi Rabbi Jacobson, can you give an explanation of what a farbrengen is? What are the origins of it? Was it something started by the Baal Shem Tov? Do other Chassidim also do farbrengens? Would a Friday night tish by Chassidus Rebbe also be considered a farbrengen? Besides for community farbrengens, usually held on important days such as Yud Tes Kislev and Yud Shvat, can a group of people make a farbrengen anytime they want? Does a farbrengen have to be formal and in a shul, or if a dozen people are sitting around a campfire, taking turns saying words of Chassidus and singing songs, would that be considered a farbrengen? And lastly, what is the connection to Malach Machal? Thank you. Okay. Again, very good questions. Some of them seem very basic, but it's good questions. So, if you look at the history of farbrengen, which means people coming together and they talk Torah take achlotas, sing songs, say l'chaim. If you think about it, it's really Moshe Rabbeinu that instituted it. We know that Moshe was mesaken lahakil kehillas. Vayakol Moshe, says the Medrash, and it's brought in Shulchan Aruch, that every Shabbos, Jews should come together and gather together communally, learn, daven, and so on. So the concept is essentially a Jewish concept throughout all of history. Especially when Golus came, and the Beis HaMikdash was no longer there, it became even more important to build Mikdash Ma'at in a Beis HaKnesset and Beis HaMedrash. But when we call farbrengen, we usually refer to the farbrengens, we talk to the Chassidish farbrengens. The Arizal had his students, I'm sure they farbrengt, as did the Gdelim before that and after. But when we talk of farbrengen, the Chassidish version, Baal Shem Tov, I have to look, we have expression the Baal Shem Tov farbrengt with his Chassidim. We know Sudas Mashiach was a form of a farbrengen, the same thing with the Maggid. So farbrengen evolved basically exactly like you just said. Chassidim come together, sometimes with the Rebbe, sometimes themselves, and any time. Whenever Chassidim come together, the expression as you alluded to, as a Chassidish farbrengen, was a Chassidish farbrengen ken uftan. Afila malach machol ken nicht uftan. This goes back all the way to the Alter Rebbe, maybe even earlier, that what a farbrengen can accomplish. Even malach machol, who's the Melech Yeshur, who's the malach, the angel that protects the Yidden and finds merit in them. He's their defense attorney, if you wish. Even he can't accomplish. Tells you the power of a farbrengen. And it could be anywhere at any time. Obviously, special times, Shabbos, Yom Tov, Yom Pagra, you said Yud Tes Kislev, Yud Shvat, is more conducive even. But a farbrengen could happen any time. It can be spontaneous, it can be planned. The Rebbe had special times of farbrengens, and there was also surprise farbrengens. So you have to distinguish between a Rebbe's farbrengen, a Chassidish farbrengen. But it always has to include Torah, Aveda, Gmilas Chasad. Meaning learning Torah, a tefillah, even if people blessing each other, and a hachlotas for actions, resolutions, saying l'chaim, singing negunim, heart-to-heart conversation with your defenses down, what a real farbrengen is supposed to be like. I'm sure there have been written articles and essays that discuss the history of a farbrengen, but suffice it for now, being the Yud Tes Kislev farbrengen we're having right now, this program, I think that gives some background. Okay. Would a Friday night tish and other things? You can call farbrengen, why not? It's not like there's no copyright on the word. You could call anytime Jews come together for good reasons is a form of a farbrengen. And it's not after a Chabad thing. We know that Alter Rebbe said Chabad is not a mafleg, it's not a party, it's for all Yidden. So technically, anytime, any type of form of where Yidden come together is a form of a farbrengen. The Rebbe would always emphasize what it says in the Geras HaKodesh, that when 10 Jews come together, that alone brings the Shekhinah, even if they don't speak divrei Torah. But how much more so when they do? Okay, that's that, farbrengen. What's the difference between a maamar and a sicha? Okay, being that it's Yud Tes Kislev, that is a fitting question. So the Rebbe himself says, a maamar is the official way that Rabbeim would deliver divrei Elikim Chayim. And over the years, with a certain song, Chassidim would rise and stand. The Rebbe would tie a handkerchief around to ground him in a sense. So there are obviously very telltale, clear signs of a maamar. That was the way Shechina medaberes metegrene, the Shechina speaking through the Rebbe and saying a maamar Chassidus. A sicha was, you can call it informal Torah, informal Chassidus. That's why you'll find the sicha, a discussion that's not always in the same language. A maamar has a particular structure. Usually begins with a pasuk, a verse, or lahav an inyan, a certain inyan. We'll ask a few questions and then begin a whole discussion. And it's based on the maamarim that came beforehand, with some rare exceptions. A sicha is very informal. Torah Shalom, you see sicha, the Rebbe Rashab says a lot of things off the record, in a good way. He'll say things that in a maamar you wouldn't quite always spell out, like between the lines, the spirit of the ideas. The Rebbe, by farbrengen, turned the whole thing, because the Rabbeim, Maimorim, was their main channel and vehicle of expression. There were vetlach, they said, by a meal and so on, but it wasn't the predominant was maimorim. And then we have some sichas. The Rebbe Rashab, we have one sicha, Sefer Teira Shalom, it's a small, slim book. Maimorim, we have years and years. Same thing with the other Rabbeim. By the Rebbe, it's the other way around. There were maimorim, thousands of maimorim. I mean, almost 2,000 maimorim, I believe, from the Rebbe. And yet, the bulk of his communication was sichas. A farbrengen would go 5-6 hours. 90% was sichas. One part was the maamar. Maybe even more than 90. There were times the Rebbe said only a maamar. But primarily sichas was the main communication, which of course includes chassidus and formal chassidus and informal and so on. That's the general difference between the two. Okay. A few more Yud Tes Kislev questions, which is good. It's a Yud Tes Kislev special edition. Is this question? A few things about the Yud Tes Kislev events. We know that there was what they called Black Maria chariot car that took the Alter Rebbe into prison. So someone's asking, what is exactly this type of vehicle, and why was it sent of the Alter Rebbe? So in the Tsarist Russia, this was a way to drive dread. The greatest criminals, especially were accused of things of mutiny and so on, were taken in these cars without windows. It was meant to drive fear into the people. The Alter Rebbe was accused of high treason. As such, they took him in that. It only shows you, on one hand, the great Helam, but also the great Gili that came, that he was redeemed from it. Once the Tsar and others and his ministers realized that the Alter Rebbe was obviously totally innocent. So we're told about that detail. How did the Alter Rebbe win his court case? What evidence did he produce to exonerate himself? So we know the Alter Rebbe wrote 21 answers. Was it 21 pages? I don't remember right now. He actually wrote in Hebrew. It was translated by a translator. Alter Rebbe went over it because he wanted to make sure it's accurate and no one's forging anything, where he answered all the accusations that he's sending money to the enemy of the Tsar, which is the Turkish king, that he wants to overthrow the Tsar, that he wants leadership, all the different things, and he wrote it in very much detail. What is a Rebbe? What is a Rebbe? What is tefillah, davening? We have now some of those that he wrote, and that was a logical, you could say Chabad, rational argument of defense against all the accusations. But obviously in Shamayim, that was the main vindication that was necessary. And finally, being that Yud Tes Kislev is also the yahrzeit of the Maggid of Mezritch, of the Rebbe of the Alter Rebbe, someone asks, what was the main important teaching of the Maggid of Mezritch? Well, it's a very hard question to answer, because like asking what's the main teaching of the Alter Rebbe, the main teaching of the Baal Shem Tov. So we know they were the foundational elements that Chassidus teaches, Avos Yisrael, the power of a neshama, Hashgacha Pratis, perpetual creation, everything is a lesson. The Maggid took this, of course, to the next level, the idea of Birurim. So I don't know if I can find one thing that stands out. Chassidus talks different teachings of the Maggid. One of the popular, or you can say, commonly quoted by the Rebbe and the Rebbe Rashab, especially the Maggid's famous mashal of how God envisions neshamas like a father envisions a child. There's the Maggid's Torah Naseh L'cha Shtei Chatzitzos, which is a big part of Ayin Beis is built on that. The Chatzitzos, the two trumpets. Shtei Chatzitzos refers to two chatzitzuras, two halves, the divine and the neshamas, and how they join together as partners. That's elaborated in Ayin Beis and Ya'aleh, Tzemach Tzedek from the Maggid. And there are other things, the famous Maggid mashal of a father hiding from his child. For the Tzimtzum, and the Rebbe cried, Tu b'Shvat, Chamish Osa b'Shvat, Tov Shel Lamed Tes. He hides so well, the child stops looking. And there's others as well. Those are just that come to mind. Hard to really define one or two or a few. It's all of Chassidus, the main fundamentals of Chassidus. Okay. With the few minutes we have left, Though there's so much more we could talk about Yud Tes Kislev, let me talk about Parshas Vayeshev a bit, as much as we can cover here. What lessons do we learn from living with the times with this week's Torah Parsha? So Vayeshev, very tragic, but also powerful Parsha, where it says Vayeshev Yaakov. Yaakov finally comes back to Eretz Yisrael. Maggid of He wants to settle in. Bikish Yaakov Leisha B'Shalfa, as Rashi says from the Medrash. He wanted to live now in peace. He had 20 years by Lavan. Before that, running from Esav. After that, dealing with Esav. Been fighting with Esav since his mother's womb. He wants some peace. Koftzalov Rugzeh Shel Yosef. No, you will not have peace in this lifetime, says Hashem. And the brothers, in their jealousy and rage, they go ahead. They first want to kill Yosef, then they end up selling him into slavery. Ends up being 22 years in Egypt, suffering, and finally becomes, at the end of Vayeshev, he's still in prison actually. It's only Mikate that he comes out of prison and then becomes the viceroy of Egypt. And that's the parsha in a nutshell. The connection to Yud Tes Kislev is immediate. Prison. He was in prison, Yosef, as the Alter Rebbe was in prison. We all know the prison is meant to bring ultimately Yosef Hurid Mitzrayim. Yosef going down to Mitzrayim was the beginning of the Yerida and Golus of Mitzrayim, with the goal of Oila Nala that will ultimately elevate from here and come out v'achri ken Yosef b'rechush gadol as God promised Avram Avinu. But the story starts in this parsha. So the lessons we learn from it is that God runs the show. Life we cannot always predict the spontaneous twists and turns. Not Yaakov, not Yosef. Nobody could predict what was going to happen here. You think it could have been beautiful there, just living in peace, serving Hashem, growing? No. The Eibishter wanted the Yidden in Mitzrayim one way or another, and they had to end up there. And it came in this very painful way. So we have to understand that this is a narrative that you have to look till the end of the story. You cannot stop in middle. The end of the story is that Yosef becomes the second in command, the Mishnah Lamelech, and he saves the world, including Yaakov and his brothers, meaning Yosef's brothers. So that's an overall lesson. But there's a lot to be discussed in the very story itself. Because we have limited time, I'll just be brief. The story about why Yaakov saw and favored Yosef in a way that the brothers, it aroused their jealousy. The Ksenis Pasim, the multicolored coat that he had. What does that mean? What were the dreams that he had, Yosef? Where the dreams indicated that he's going to rule over his brothers. And how could they sell him into slavery? Shvatim, Shiftei Yudke, Mitose Shlema, these were tzaddikim. So let's just answer those questions briefly. You have to remember, just like the story with Yaakov and Esav, there's a bigger cosmic story going on here, both on a personal and on a global level. The Shvatim would be the foundation of the Jewish people. Every Shevet had his role. Yaakov saw in Yosef that there would be leadership and we would need him, because Yosef represented Talmud. The Gemara says Talmud Gadol, that's Yosef. Yehuda represents Maisa Gadol. Yehuda Haidah. And Malachim, the kings and leaders in Israel, would come from Yehuda. But what was not known, that before you get to Yehuda, you have to go through Yosef. So Yosef's dreams was indicating the future. That before you reach to Maisa Gadol Asad Lave, you need to learn Talmud first. You need Yosef to direct. The Shvatim looked at it and saw this as a Maggid of Mezritch. They knew Yehuda is going to be giving kingship. And here Yosef is suddenly dreaming that he's going to be the leader and they're going to bow to him. Mamash Maggid of Mezritch Chayev Misa. They wanted Mashiach ben David. What they didn't know is that Mashiach ben David firstly needs to be preceded by Mashiach ben Yosef. Because Maisa, as much as this world is going to be saturated with godliness, but who directs us? Torah, Talmud. So this wasn't about petty jealousy of brothers. This was a story that had to play itself out in this way, and later we understand it. Later you find that from Yosef came Malchus Yisrael, from Yehuda, Malchus Yehuda, and they also split off after Shlomo HaMelech, and ultimately led to all kinds of tzaras. But then we read in the Haftarah of Parsha Vayigash that then that they'll ultimately join. So there's the conflicts between them, different approaches, but ultimately joining together. So that's why Yehuda plays such a central role, both in this week's Parsha, instigating against Yosef, and then later in Vayigash, Elov Yehuda, in confronting Yosef, and finally the reconciliation. So it's really a story of different paths that, yes, in a world that's not perfect, can lead to this type of tension, more than tension. And that was what was playing out here, about how we bring Mashiach. And briefly, Ma'aseh Gadol is the world of L'Asad is when a world is completely saturated with godliness. You don't need to learn Torah. That's why the halacha is Ma'aseh Gadol, because our very nature will experience godliness. Today we need to learn because we need to know what to do. We can't sense it. We feel that we're hungry, our bodies. But you don't know what the neshama needs. So you need to look at Shulchan Aruch and Torah. You need Yosef. Once that's finished, then as the Alter Rebbe says in the Yud Tes 26, Siman Chavav, the Balagula, L'Asad Lavi, you don't need Torah for Isser v'Heter, for right and wrong, because we'll know it naturally. So why do we learn Torah? For Yechudim Elyanim, L'Yachid Yechudim, to reach higher levels. So we'll always have a Yosef. But before getting to the leadership of Yehuda, of Malchus, you need to have Yesod, which is Yosef. Yosef is Yesod to Yehuda's Malchus. Now there's a lot more to be said on this. I just wanted to be brief. It deserves more discussion. And I'm going to end the program now because of time limits. The main thing is, you have a good Yontif, a Rosh Hashana, L'Shana Teva, Limud Chassidus, B'darkei Chassidus, Tichaseva v'Tichasemu. Let us use this Rosh Hashana as a launch pad to do the final steps of Yefutza Meinesecha Chutza in every possible way, reaching the farthest outskirts with Chassidus. We've been given the license to do so and do so more and more every year until the world is saturated with Mola Ores Deus Hashem Kamayim Layom Echasim, a world filled with divine knowledge as the waters cover the sea. Begula Amitis V'Ashlema B'Korim Mamish. This has been MyLife Chassidus Applied, special Yud Tes Kislev edition. A good Yontev, everyone. A good Yor, a good bench Yor. We're here every Sunday, 8 to 9 p.m. And until next week, everyone have a Gvaldike Yud Tes Kislev, a Lebedike, a Freiliche Yud Tes Kislev, and a Freilichen Tamid.
This program is brought to you by MyLife Chassidus Applied. Please help us continue our programs. Make even a small contribution at chassidusapply.com/donate.